They said snow could hide everything, blood, tears, even history. But one winter, the Volga River refused to stay silent. Beneath its frozen skin, red began to bloom, slow and deliberate, like the pulse of something buried too long. The wind howled across the plain, carrying whispers that no one could trace, and all of Russia shivered, though not from the cold alone. In the villages along the river, the nights came early and left late. Smoke from small fires clung to the air like ghosts refusing to rise. Men bent over the earth with cracked hands. Women carried buckets of water that froze before they reached the door. They spoke little because words could not feed the children, and silence had long been their safest prayer. For generations they were called serfs, souls tied to the soil, bound to the will of the masters who owned both land and breath. It was said that even death needed permission to visit them. They worked not for coin, but for survival, their names written only in the ledgers of their lords, erased with a single stroke when the body failed. The empire called it order, and the church called it divine. But under the weight of frost, faith can splinter like glass. When the overseer's whip cracked through the mist, the peasants did not cry out. They only lowered their heads deeper, afraid that God had turned his face away for good. Catherine the Great ruled far to the north, her palaces bright as suns against the endless dark. She dreamed of science and progress, spoke of reason while her empire starved. The nobles drank to her wisdom, their glasses chiming like bells in the snow. None of them could hear the quiet grinding of hunger beneath their feet. At night, the peasants gathered in barns where the cold could not follow. They whispered of omens. Wolves seen at crossroads, fires burning blue in the distance, a voice in the wind calling from the east. Some said it was a ghost, others a king, and a few dared to hope it was both. Hope is dangerous in a land built on silence. Then came the rumor. A rider, crossing the frozen plains, claiming to be the dead Tsar, returned to life. He bore the scars of exile, the voice of command, and the madness of faith. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev, a man of smoke and salt and fury. He said the throne had been stolen, and God himself had sent him to restore it. The first who saw him fell to their knees, not from belief, but from exhaustion. The second kissed the hem of his coat. The third picked up an axe and followed. Soon, whole villages began to move, plowmen, soldiers, beggars, widows, drawn by something older than fear. The river seemed to throb with their footsteps. In every tavern, the story grew sharper. They said he healed the sick, that his horse never tired, that the snow turned red where he passed. The rumor reached the ears of the dying and gave them reason to live one more day. In the empire of cold, even lies can burn bright enough to warm the lost. The masters laughed at first. They said peasants were too slow to rise, too dull to dream. But the laughter faded when the first estate went dark, its windows broken, its fields smoking. No messengers returned from the south. The empire began to realize that the snow was not hiding their sins, it was burying them alive. One night, the bells of a noble's house rang without hands to pull them. By morning, the house was gone, replaced by a mound of ash and a silence that trembled. The servants who escaped swore they saw men walking barefoot through the fire, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting the flames like mirrors. The peasants called it judgment, the nobles called it madness, and the church had no word for it at all. Across the frozen countryside, torches bloomed like stars against the white. The serfs who had once prayed for deliverance now became the storm they had feared for centuries. They followed Pugachev without question, without rest, without doubt. He promised land, bread, justice, and the end of suffering. They did not ask how. Faith had replaced thought. To them, he was not a man, but a voice in the snow that finally answered back. The empire awoke too late. Soldiers marched south into a world of smoke and frost, where roads no longer existed and loyalty melted like ice in blood. The line between savior and monster blurred in the fog, and no one could tell if Pugachev led them to freedom or to ruin. By the time spring should have come, the fields were nothing but ash. The river ran thick with what it remembered, carrying away the evidence of revolt. And somewhere in that shifting current, a whisper lingered, soft, defiant, and alive. The Tsar lives. But the Volga, patient as ever, knew better. It had seen empires rise and sink beneath its skin. It had drunk from the mouths of kings and peasants alike. It understood what no man ever learned, that blood and water are one, and both remember what the world tries to forget. And so the snow kept falling, hiding, covering, forgiving. But deep beneath, the red remained. The river did not sleep. It only waited for another thaw, another name, another voice to stir the silence again. The man who called himself Tsar rode with the wind at his back and the frost in his beard. His horse was lean, his cloak torn, but his eyes burned with a calm that frightened even those who believed in him. He spoke little, yet every word seemed to weigh more than the snow itself. The peasants saw not a man but a promise wrapped in rags. He moved from village to village, gathering the forgotten. Cossacks who had deserted, widows who had lost everything, children who had never known a sunrise without hunger. To each he gave the same message. The throne has fallen to a false ruler, and heaven demands its restoration. In a land so empty of hope, the lie felt holy. At first he carried no weapon, only a wooden cross tied to his saddle, blackened by weather and years. When he raised it, men knelt, and when he lowered it, they rose again like a tide. He told them that Catherine was a serpent in human skin, that God had sent him to burn her poison out of the empire. His words spread faster than any army could march. Somewhere between faith and madness, his following became a nation. They built fires on the open plains, hammered iron into crude swords, turned farm tools into weapons of salvation. The snow was their map, the sky their shield, and the Volga their witness. No one dared to count how many followed him, even numbers feared the truth. Catherine's governors sent warnings northward, but each messenger vanished before reaching the capital. The letters that did arrive were stained with soot and blood, their ink frozen halfway through the page. One read simply, "The peasants no longer ask for bread, they ask for vengeance." The empress gathered her court, cloaked in gold and calm, yet her hand trembled when she held the reports. To the nobles, she spoke of order and destiny, of how reason would triumph over chaos. But in her private chambers, she ordered the guards doubled and the windows shut tight against the wind. Meanwhile, in the south, the sermons of Pugachev turned into oaths. He declared his new law: no master above another, no tax, no chain, no czar but the one who walks among you. The peasants wept, some from joy, others from terror. They knew that such words had never been spoken aloud in Russia and survived. The first execution came quietly. A noble caught trying to flee was dragged into the snow. Pugachev said nothing as the crowd closed in. When it was done, he only whispered, "The land remembers its owners." From that day, the rebellion no longer prayed for mercy, it prayed for balance. Night after night, the wind carried their songs across the steppe. No music, no instruments, only the rhythm of feet and the echo of shovels striking earth. They buried the dead where they fell, marked only by torches frozen in the ground. To them, each grave was a seed, and spring would be their harvest. The empire began to blur at its edges. Towns once loyal raised new banners, white cloth stained red by hand. Even the soldiers sent to crush them sometimes switched sides, whispering that perhaps this was justice after all. When belief spreads faster than fear, no crown can hold. But within the fire of his movement, Pugachev began to see shadows. Men argued over spoils, others called themselves prophets in his name. The purity of the cause was melting beneath greed and hunger. He looked into their eyes and saw not freedom, but the same desperation he had sworn to destroy. Still, he rode on, through the cold, through the smoke, through the noise of his own legend. He slept little, spoke less, and each morning the lines around his eyes deepened. Sometimes he would stare at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, a man too small for the crown that rumor had given him. In one village, an old priest dared to ask, "If you are Tsar, where is your mercy?" Pugachev smiled without warmth. "Mercy belongs to the dead," he said, "and I am not dead yet." That night, the priest was gone, and no one dared to ask again. Catherine's armies finally began to move. Thousands of soldiers, cannons rumbling through the frozen earth. But war moves slower than faith. By the time they reached the Volga, entire provinces had already burned, and the snow had turned gray from ash. It was no longer rebellion, it was revelation. Still, even revelations have limits. Pugachev's men were starving, freezing, their faith thinned by exhaustion. Yet, he pressed forward, claiming victory where there was only survival. To retreat was to admit mortality, and a god cannot bleed in front of his worshippers. The empire would later call him a criminal, a liar, a thief. But in that winter, he was more than any of them. He was every hunger given a name, every silence turned into thunder. When he rode through the night, even the wolves gave way, and somewhere, far away, Catherine's mirror cracked from the cold. She did not notice at first, but when she looked closer, she swore she saw a face behind her own, wild, unblinking, and smiling. The first fires began without orders. In a village near the Volga, a child froze to death while the nobleman's storehouses overflowed with grain. By morning, the manor was burning, and the people stood in the snow watching it fall. No one spoke a word, as if speech might ruin the sacredness of their anger. The flames reached the sky before the soldiers arrived. They found no enemy, only footprints and silence. The peasants had vanished into the woods, carrying their dead and their new faith. Behind them, the snow hissed as it melted, turning white ground into mud the color of blood. From that moment, the rebellion no longer needed Pugachev's voice. It spread on its own, like fire under ice, slow and unstoppable. Every torch lit in one village became 10 in another. Every scream became a hymn. Russia was burning from the inside, and the empire didn't yet know it. In Kazan, the smoke was so thick that it blotted out the stars. The nobles barricaded themselves in their mansions, praying to a god they'd forgotten to serve. Outside, peasants marched with icons and axes, singing songs that made even their enemies weep. Some believed the angels marched beside them, others thought hell had opened its gates. Pugachev watched it all with a face carved from stone. The fires he had lit were now beyond control, each one a sermon he could no longer retract. His followers called him the new Tsar, the chosen one, the voice of heaven. Yet when he looked into their eyes, he saw the same hunger that had once driven him to rebellion, and he feared it. The empire finally struck back. Columns of soldiers advanced through snow so deep it buried the dead where they fell. Villages were leveled, fields salted, wells filled with corpses. Still, the rebels refused to disappear. Each death seemed to feed the next uprising, as if the earth itself was fighting to breathe. Catherine's generals wrote letters soaked with desperation. They spoke of phantom armies, of peasants who fought even after losing limbs, of entire towns that vanished before dawn. "They do not retreat," one wrote, "they dissolve into the snow." The empress read in silence, her fingers tightening around her cup of wine. In the rebel camps, there was no warmth, only conviction. Men huddled together for heat, sharing crusts of frozen bread, whispering that they were living inside the prophecy. Women carried torches higher than their heads, their shadows long and wild on the snow. For the first time, they were not invisible. The frost itself became an enemy. Horses fell where they stood, their breath freezing midair. Muskets cracked, gunpowder turned to dust. When battle came, it was fought not with skill, but with faith and madness. A single charge could last hours, ending with two armies locked together in silence, waiting to see which would freeze first. Pugachev's generals began to break. Some deserted, others looted what little was left. He executed them with his own hands, eyes hollow and calm. "Discipline," he said, though even he no longer knew what that word meant. He had become both king and executioner, savior and storm. One night he rode alone through the burned remains of a town that had once welcomed him. The church had collapsed, the cross blackened. In the center square lay a broken bell half buried in ice. He touched it, and the sound it made was small but endless, like time cracking. He knew then that no victory could outlast the frost. In the north, Catherine's armies gathered again, larger, colder, determined. This time they marched not for conquest but for erasure. She did not want a war. She wanted a silence so deep that even memory would not crawl out of it. The empress was fighting a ghost, and she meant to win. As the two forces closed, the world seemed to stop breathing. The snow fell heavier, muting everything. The clash of blades, the screams, the prayers. Under the gray sky, thousands died without sound, their bodies stiffening in poses of prayer and defiance. The Volga ran red that day, though no one dared to call it blood. Pugachev's army, outnumbered and starving, still fought as if the sky itself were watching. They hurled stones when powder ran out, teeth when their hands froze. When they could no longer stand, they crawled, and when they could no longer crawl, they sang. The empire had cannons, but it did not have songs like these. In Kazan again, the flames returned. The city burned twice, once from rebellion, once from revenge. Neither side remembered who lit the match. When the ashes settled, the snow came down like mercy, covering everything it could. History would call it a battle, but the survivors knew better. It was a funeral for the living. That winter ended slower than most. Spring refused to come, as if afraid of what it might find beneath the ice. The rivers stayed frozen, the sun dimmed, and the wolves grew bold. Even the air tasted like iron. People said the sky itself was tired of watching. And through it all, Pugachev rode on. His followers called him immortal, but he knew better. Each sunrise felt like a debt he could not repay. His dream had become a mirror, one side glory, the other ruin. In both, his reflection stared back with the same hollow eyes. By the time the thaw began, there was no empire left to save, only a vast white silence scattered with bones. And in that silence, the wind carried the faintest echo of laughter, his, or God's, or perhaps the river's. The fire had burned itself out, but the frost had learned to bleed. The war left nothing behind but smoke and bones. Villages that had once sung in defiance now whispered only prayers for food. Fields lay open like scars, charred black against the endless white. The empire called it peace, but peace built on silence is only another form of war. Catherine's armies marched north again, not to conquer, but to cleanse. They burned what was left of Pugachev's rebellion, salted the earth, and hanged the living for fear the dead might rise. The empress watched the reports pile high on her desk and said softly, "At last, order returns." But the mirrors in her chambers trembled. In Moscow, she held banquets to celebrate victory. The halls glittered with candlelight, violins sang, and the air smelled of wine and wax. Yet every toast echoed strangely, hollow like an unburied bell. When she closed her eyes, she saw the Volga still bleeding through the ice, red as guilt, wide as memory. Far to the south, the survivors wandered. They no longer called themselves soldiers or serfs or believers, only remnants. Their faces were smoke-stained, their eyes too tired for tears. They built fires that gave no heat and spoke in whispers that froze before reaching the air. Pugachev rode among them in silence. His horse limped, its breath shallow, the color of ash. The crown they once imagined on his head had long since melted into myth. Yet when they saw him, they still straightened, as if the world might change again with a single word. He gave none. He looked upon the ruins of his dream and saw something cruelly familiar. Hierarchy, greed, men drunk on their own righteousness. His army had become the empire he meant to destroy, only colder. He understood then that revolutions do not create freedom. They only reveal how much people are willing to suffer for its illusion. The empress, meanwhile, dictated new decrees in her marble palace. She outlawed the very memory of rebellion. Books mentioning Pugachev were burned, songs silenced, children taught that loyalty was life and dissent a disease. She had survived her ghost and meant to bury it deep beneath her crown. But ghosts do not obey laws. Along the Volga, travelers claimed to see a lone rider moving through the fog, carrying a torch that never went out. In the mornings, only hoofprints remained, leading toward the frozen river. The peasants said it was the false Tsar still searching for his people. The nobles said it was just the wind. Catherine's advisors urged her to ignore such tales, but she began to close her curtains at night. She could not bear the sound of wind over snow. It sounded too much like chains breaking. Some nights she dreamed of fire, others of drowning in a river that whispered her name. In the rebel lands, the snow refused to melt. The earth stayed hard, unyielding, as if it too mourned what it had seen. Even the birds flew wide around those places. When spring came, it brought no flowers, only bones rising from the thaw, white as the faith that had driven them there. Pugachev's men, what few remained, begged him to flee east to the Ural Mountains. "We can rebuild," they said. "We can wait for another season." But he only shook his head. "You cannot build freedom on corpses," he murmured, "and the snow is full of them." His breath fogged, then vanished like confession. When at last he was captured, it happened not in battle, but in betrayal. His own guards handed him to the empire for gold and pardon. As they bound his hands, he smiled, not in anger, but in recognition. He had seen this before in every kingdom and every sermon. The price of believing men could be better than fear. Catherine ordered that he be brought to Moscow alive. "A symbol," she said, "must die where symbols are made." The journey north took weeks. Villages lined the roads, not to cheer, not to curse, but to stare. They did not see a monster or a savior, only a mirror held up to themselves. When he reached the city, the sky was the color of iron. The crowd gathered silently, breath steaming like smoke. Catherine watched from behind a window as they led him to the scaffold. The executioner's axe gleamed, sharp as history's memory. For the first time, the Empress crossed herself. They say he looked at the blade and whispered something no one could hear. Some thought it was forgiveness, others thought it was a curse. The axe fell, and the sound rang across the square like the cracking of frozen ground. The crowd exhaled as one, and the empire pretended it could breathe again. That night, snow began to fall over Moscow. It fell softly, tenderly, as if the sky itself wanted to cover the shame. Catherine sat in her study, staring at a candle that refused to stay lit. She whispered, "There is no Tsar but reason." But reason did not answer, only the wind did. By dawn, the Volga carried a new silence downstream. The fires had died, the frost had settled, and the river was free again. But it did not forget. Beneath its slow gray surface, the red still lingered, faint and patient, like truth waiting for another century to speak. And far above, in the marble city, the Empress slept at last, her dreams full of snow, her empire built on ashes. The scaffold had not yet cooled when the stories began. Some said he smiled as he died, others swore his body vanished before it touched the ground. The soldiers dragged the remains away, but the crowd lingered, unwilling to leave the silence he had left behind. The snow fell thicker that night, as if trying to bury the memory before it could grow roots. Catherine ordered that his name be erased from every record, his followers hunted, his ashes scattered. Yet no matter how many words she burned, the wind kept speaking them again. In taverns, in barns, in whispered prayers, the peasants began to call him not a traitor, but a ghost of justice. The empire had killed the man, but awakened the myth. Along the Volga, widows came to the river carrying candles made of animal fat. They floated them on the ice, each one trembling in the dark like a small defiance. The guards called it superstition. The women called it memory. The river took the light and carried it downstream, where it burned quietly under the moon. In time, Pugachev's rebellion became a forbidden story, told only in the hush between storms when the snow muffled every sound. Children grew up hearing of the man who rose from nowhere and dared to speak God's name without permission. Their mothers told them to forget. Their fathers stared into the fire and did not answer. The nobles rebuilt their houses with thicker walls and smaller windows. They feared the silence more than the screams. Each winter they prayed for shorter nights, yet every dawn seemed to come later than the one before. Peace had returned, but it carried the weight of something unburied. Catherine grew older, her victories turning to ghosts around her. At banquets, she laughed too loudly, drank too quickly, her hands glittering with jewels that felt heavier each year. When she looked into her mirror, she thought she saw the snow behind her, red at the edges, whispering. She told herself it was only memory. The empire stretched wider with every conquest, but its heart stayed hollow. New cities rose where villages had burned, and statues were built where gallows once stood. The rulers praised order, but order only made the silence cleaner. Beneath the marble and music, the ground still breathed, restless and raw. In the provinces, the people learned to work without hope. They harvested wheat from the same fields that had once fed rebellion, their sickles slicing through ghosts. Sometimes the soil turned darker in certain places, and no one would touch it. They said that was where the blood slept. They said if you disturbed it, the frost would return. During one winter famine, an old man told the soldiers who came for grain, "The land has eaten too much of us, it will choke soon." They beat him and left him for dead. The next spring, his words came true. The fields refused to bloom. The harvest was thin, and the empire called it divine punishment. The peasants called it revenge. Decades passed, but his legend only grew sharper with time. Pain makes memory fertile. They said he would come again when the snow turned red once more, that he was not dead but sleeping beneath the river, waiting for the call of thunder. Mothers used his name to frighten their children, and dreamers used it to keep themselves alive. In Moscow, scholars wrote that his uprising had been meaningless, a peasant tantrum against progress. They filled pages with numbers and logic, but between the lines, the ink still bled. History can explain anything except why the dead keep returning. When Catherine finally died, her funeral procession passed along the same road that once carried Pugachev in chains. The peasants along the route stood silent, hats in hand, faces blank. To them, two ghosts were passing, the ruler and the rebel, bound together in the same endless winter. The empire that followed tried to build a future from their bones. Factories rose, railroads spread like veins of steel across the snow, and the world turned faster than before. But the faster it turned, the more the people forgot what they were running from. Forgetting became survival. Survival became obedience. Yet each winter, the Volga still froze, and when the first crack of thaw came, it sounded like a drumbeat. Those who listened said it was the river remembering, the pulse of something waiting beneath. They said it was the blood harvest beginning again. Somewhere in the dark, an old song returned, the same melody sung by starving men 2 centuries before. No one remembered the words, but the rhythm stayed, steady and ancient, like a warning. The snow hides many things, but not forever. And as the ice broke apart and the river ran wild once more, the people stood watching in silence. In the current, they swore they saw a figure on horseback, drifting, faceless, turning east. No one spoke. They simply watched, and the wind whispered his name, not as a curse, but as a promise. Winter came again, as it always does, uninvited and unmerciful. The empire was older now, its borders swollen, its faith worn thin. The nobles had changed their names, the peasants their prayers, but the snow remembered both. Nothing in Russia truly dies, it only freezes, waiting for a new name. The children of the survivors worked the same land their parents had burned. They plowed through the same ashes, unaware that the ground still whispered beneath their feet. Each furrow opened like a scar, each harvest carried the taste of iron. History had buried its dead in plain sight and called it order. The new rulers spoke of progress. They built factories, railways, and prisons, 3 kinds of chains for the same kind of soul. The smoke from their chimneys darkened the sky until even daylight looked like twilight. They said it was the dawn of industry, but the sun seemed to bleed trying to rise. In the cities, men with soft hands and sharper words wrote laws meant to tame hunger. They promised equality, reform, reason. But reason does not plow fields, and hunger does not wait for paperwork. Beneath their speeches, the people still bent their backs and whispered to the frost for mercy. They told themselves rebellion would never return, that the river's ghosts had finally gone quiet. But silence, in Russia, is never peace, it is incubation. Somewhere in that stillness, something old began to stir, like a breath drawn before confession. The empire was not healed, it was holding its breath. A century passed, and the winters grew harder. The rulers changed, some crowned, some executed, but the snow stayed the same. Empires fell and rose again, yet the peasants' hands never left the soil. They no longer spoke of Pugachev by name, but his shadow walked among them all the same. In distant monasteries, forbidden manuscripts whispered his story. Monks copied his name in invisible ink, illuminated by candlelight that smoked and trembled. They wrote not of rebellion, but of prophecy. The false Tsar, they said, will rise again when the blood of the humble outweighs the pride of the mighty. The empire had forgotten faith, but the people had not forgotten fear. And fear, when starved long enough, turns to worship. They built shrines in secret to unnamed saints, to faceless riders in the snow. Some left bread, others blood. The difference mattered less with each passing year. When the revolution came again, it wore a new face, red instead of white, but made of the same frost. The banners changed, the slogans shouted louder, yet the rhythm was old. Men still died for promises they did not understand. and the Volga carried their bodies the same way it had carried their fathers. The betrayal was not in the killing, it was in the forgetting. Each new ruler claimed to free the people from the last, and each built a higher wall around the same prison. The people cheered, and the chains changed shape. Freedom had become a language they no longer spoke, only hummed in their sleep. Old women by the river warned their grandchildren, "Do not speak of ghosts near water, the river might answer." But sometimes the children did, laughing, tossing stones into the current. The ripples glowed faintly red at sunset, and the laughter faded before reaching the far bank. In the archives of St. Petersburg, a scholar uncovered a fragment of parchment, the last letter of an unnamed rebel. It read, "The frost has betrayed us. It no longer hides the dead. It preserves them." He showed it to no one. He simply folded it back into the drawer and locked it away, afraid of what it meant. Meanwhile, far from the cities, farmers began to find bones surfacing in their fields after every thaw. They stacked them quietly at the edges of their land, building pale fences of remembrance. When priests came to bless the soil, the men turned their backs, for they knew God had been a bystander before. The betrayal of winter was not that it was cold, it was that it remembered too much. Each flake that fell carried a trace of something once living, once defiant. When the wind blew hard enough, the fields whispered names that had been forbidden for centuries. The empire could not silence the weather. In one village, a dying man confessed to his priest that his great-grandfather had betrayed Pugachev for a sack of gold. "Does sin fade with the bloodline?" he asked. The priest had no answer. The man smiled and said, "Then I will see him soon." When he was buried, the river thawed early. The modern rulers paved roads over the old killing fields. They built power lines and factories on the bones of rebellion. But sometimes, when the lights flickered, the workers swore they heard hoofbeats echoing beneath the concrete. It was impossible, they said, but they walked faster just the same. In winter, the Volga froze thicker than ever before. The people said it was tired of carrying so much memory. Yet when the first crack split the ice, the sound was louder than thunder. The empire called it a natural phenomenon. The villagers called it the river, remembering its promise. And so the snow fell again, beautiful, indifferent, eternal. The people watched it cover the fields, the graves, the ruins, until everything looked pure again. But purity, in Russia, is only a disguise for forgetting. Beneath the white lay centuries of red. Beneath the silence, the slow breathing of history, waiting for another voice to wake it. They called him the false Tsar, but even lies have afterlives. His death was supposed to end the dream, yet the dream refused to die. It lived in whispers, in songs hummed under breath, in the silence between the empress's victories. A false Tsar had fallen, but a true hunger had been born. In the years that followed, no one spoke his name in daylight. But when the nights grew long and the frost crept through the cracks, people remembered. They told the story differently each time. Sometimes he was a prophet, sometimes a devil, but always he rode through the snow, unbroken. The empire could erase his words, not his echo. Catherine's successors ruled with one eye always fixed on the river. They feared its floods more than any army, for each thaw seemed to bring something back. When the ice cracked open, it sounded like a drum, like a call to rise. No wonder they built their capitals far from the Volga's voice. Some say his spirit wandered the roads for years after, searching for the body it had lost. Others said he became the frost itself, drifting from window to window, asking the living what they had done with their courage. People learned to shut their shutters tight, but courage, once questioned, never sleeps again. In the archives, an officer's diary told of a patrol that vanished near the old rebel lands. Only their horses returned, eyes wide, flanks foamed with ice. When they were slaughtered for meat, the soldiers swore the flesh tasted of salt, like tears. No one ever rode that road again. The empire called it superstition, but superstition has longer memory than law. Each new czar feared the shadow of the old false one. Each made promises to the peasants, built cathedrals, raised taxes, and waited for the frost to rise again. History became a circle drawn in snow, never closing, never clean. Meanwhile, the peasants learned that silence was safer than truth. They worked, they aged, they died, and the earth swallowed them without question. But sometimes, at the edge of sleep, they saw him, his eyes burning like coals, his voice low and steady. "I am still here," it said. "You are still mine." Generations passed, and he turned into a parable. Teachers said his name meant madness. Priests said it meant sin, but the children saw only wonder in the sound. They repeated it in secret, trying the syllables like forbidden fruit. Each repetition kept him alive a little longer. During the great famines, when bread turned to dust and prayer to noise, the peasants looked up to the gray horizon and whispered, "Tsar or no Tsar, someone will answer." The wind answered first. It came from the east, sharp as memory, and carried the faintest sound of hooves on frozen ground. Scholars would later call this collective myth the wish of the poor for a savior. But myths are only the bones of truth, stripped bare to survive the centuries. The myth of Pugachev endured because he had stopped being a man. He had become the question Russia could never stop asking itself: what is freedom worth? The nobles who mocked him found no peace either. Their wealth grew, their lands expanded, yet they slept uneasily. Each creak in the floorboards, each gust through the chimney felt like the ghost of justice knocking. They tried to pray, but prayer sounds different when it echoes in marble halls. In one letter, a general confessed to his son, "We won the war, but I think we lost the country." He burned the letter after writing it, but the smoke lingered, curling like ink above his bed. That night, the frost came early, sealing the windows from the inside. The peasants buried their dead without priests, saying the church had chosen the wrong side of heaven. They sang old songs to guide the spirits home, songs once forbidden, now older than memory. Each verse ended the same. The Tsar sleeps, but the snow remembers. And the snow did remember. It remembered the weight of hooves, the warmth of blood, the defiance in dying breath. When storms swept across the plains, the wind carried a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. The empire said it was thunder. The peasants knew better. Over time, his name began to return, first in whispers, then in poems, then in the mouths of men who dreamed of new revolutions. They called him a warning, not a hero. Yet even warnings, repeated long enough, become prayers. When the next rebellion came, his portrait appeared again, rough, crude, carved into wood and smudged with soot. The faces were wrong, the crown missing, but the eyes were always right, burning, watching, unblinking. The people marched with them as if carrying the sun through snow. In the palaces, rulers cursed him as they signed decrees to stop the unrest. "He is dead," they said. "He was never real." But history has a habit of disobeying orders, and in every speech that promised a new dawn, his ghost could be heard laughing softly behind the applause. The fall of the false Tsar was never a single moment. It was every moment that came after, each lie told in his absence, each truth buried in his name. He fell in Moscow, but he kept falling for centuries, through kings, through revolutions, through the long winter of men. And somewhere between frost and fire, his story waited, unfinished. The snow could not cover it, the empire could not silence it, and the river could not drown it. Because the river had learned what no ruler ever could. The dead do not stay buried in a land that refuses to forget. The empire learned its lesson well, not how to rule, but how to forget. It built monuments to silence, museums to obedience, and called them progress. Memory became treason, and history was rewritten in softer ink. The people bowed not because they believed, but because they had run out of ways to remember. Schools taught a cleaner version of time. The textbooks spoke of prosperity, of the wisdom of rulers, of order restored. The pages smelled of new paper and denial. The children recited every word, unaware that the truth had been buried just beneath their feet, humming quietly like a heart refusing to die. Catherine was long gone, her empire fragmented into new shapes, but her spirit survived in marble and bureaucracy. Every ruler since her wore her shadow like a second crown. They built cities on bones and libraries on ashes, convinced that if the past was paved over thick enough, it would stop breathing. But the past does not suffocate. It ferments. In villages along the Volga, old women still hummed the outlawed songs. Their voices were low and cracked, blending with the sound of the river. They didn't know all the words anymore, but they remembered the melody. And memory, even half remembered, is rebellion. The officials came to these villages sometimes carrying clipboards and smiles. They spoke of census, of loyalty, of modernity. The villagers nodded and said nothing. When the officials left, the people waited for the wind to carry the smell of paper away before speaking freely again. A century passed in the empire's silence, but silence grows heavy when it lasts too long. It presses against walls, seeps into wood, infects the air itself. The children of those who had forgotten began to dream of things they'd never been taught: fires, riders, snow that glowed red beneath their feet. In one forgotten town, a mural appeared overnight on the wall of an abandoned church. It showed a man with no face, holding a torch that burned in both directions, forward and backward. The officials painted over it the next day, but the paint blistered and peeled. Beneath it, the torch kept reappearing. The empire called this vandalism. The people called it warning. They began to see the faceless man everywhere, in the smoke of factories, in the fog rising from the river, in the cracks that formed on statues of long-dead kings. He was not Pugachev anymore. He was what forgetting looks like when it starts to remember itself. In St. Petersburg, a historian dared to publish a small essay about the uprising of the nameless. The pamphlet was banned within hours, the author vanished, the printing press confiscated. But by then, copies had already been read aloud in taverns, rewritten by hand, folded into pockets like prayer. The empire sent censors, police, soldiers, all the tools of amnesia. But words, once spoken, do not die. They adapt. They became graffiti, lullabies, folk tales. A lie can be erased, but a question cannot. And the question had returned. Why does the snow always hide red beneath it? Factories roared, trains howled, cities expanded, but the ghosts kept pace. Workers sang work songs that were older than the machines themselves, tapping rhythms that echoed the drums of old uprisings. They didn't know what the beats meant. They only knew they felt true. The empire mistook rhythm for obedience. When famine came again, it came quietly, wrapped in reports and statistics. The officials blamed the weather, the people blamed the empire, and the river, patient as always, carried both excuses downstream. Some said it sounded almost like laughter, the kind that hurts more than crying. The church tried to reclaim the story, calling Pugachev a sinner redeemed by death. They built a small chapel near the site of his capture, offering candles for the souls of rebels. But every night, someone blew the candles out. The priests gave up trying to relight them. Children began to play a game in the snow. One child lay still, pretending to be buried, while the others marched around chanting, "Wake the Tsar, wake the Tsar." Teachers scolded them, parents forbade it, but the chant returned each winter. The children never learned where the words came from. The empire declared an age of enlightenment, parades of light and banners. It announced to the world that it had conquered darkness, but the brighter the streets became, the deeper the shadows stretched. And in those shadows, the old stories grew strong again, root by root, word by word. In time, no one could tell where history ended and myth began. Scholars argued, politicians lied, poets were imprisoned for rhymes too sharp. The empire thought it could drown the past in noise, but the noise only gave the ghosts a new language. Memory had gone underground, waiting for a thaw. During the coldest winter of the century, the Volga froze so thick that even the birds refused to cross it. Villagers said they could see faces trapped beneath the ice, eyes open, mouths moving. Some prayed, others knelt and listened. No one could hear the words, but everyone understood them. By spring, the ice had broken, and the empire declared another triumph. It announced that the people were happy, the past resolved, the future secure. The announcements echoed through loudspeakers across the squares, cheerful and hollow. The people clapped. The river did not. That night, the wind rose again, sharp and restless. It swept through the cities, knocking out lights, rattling windows, scattering papers across empty streets. In the dark, someone began to hum an old melody, slow, trembling, and familiar. And as it spread, the empire trembled too, for nothing is more dangerous than a song that refuses to die. It began with the fog. Thick, pale, and endless, it rolled over the Volga until the river vanished from sight. The fishermen said it was only weather. The old ones shook their heads. They had seen this before, the fog that came not to hide, but to return. At night, the waters glowed faintly red beneath the ice. Children pointed and said the river was breathing. The elders told them not to look too long. Some things, they said, see you back. But curiosity runs deeper than fear, and soon every village was watching the water for signs. Voices were heard first, faint murmurs beneath the wind, too slow for words, too human to be storms. Some swore it was the sound of prayers, others said it was laughter. The empire sent inspectors who found nothing, but their reports were short, their signatures trembling. None of them returned a second time. The people began to dream of riders crossing the river at night. Hooves made no sound, and their torches burned blue instead of gold. In the morning, strange prints marked the snow, neither hoof nor foot, but something in between. They led toward the east and vanished where the river curved. By spring, the fog had settled into memory, but the villages had changed. No one whistled after sunset. No one dared throw stones into the water. Each thaw seemed to release whispers that grew clearer each year. The Volga was no longer a river. It was a mouth. In one village, a farmer digging for new roots unearthed an old saber, rusted and black. When he touched it, his hand bled where no edge remained. He buried it again, but the wound never healed. Every winter, it opened by itself, no matter how warm the fire. The government called these stories hysteria. The priests called them punishment. But the people knew better. The ghosts were not angry, they were patient. They had waited centuries for the living to remember. Memory, after all, is the truest resurrection. One evening, the fog crept into the towns, swallowing streets, muffling bells. When it cleared, the statues in the squares had changed. Some faced the river now, some smiled who had not smiled before. The next day, the officials painted them black to hide the cracks that looked too much like veins. Letters began to circulate, unsigned, untraceable, written in ash instead of ink. "The river remembers," they read. "The frost will answer." The empire dismissed them as nonsense, but soldiers refused to patrol near the banks. They said the silence there pressed too close, as if the air itself were listening. One night, the river froze mid-current, a single sheet of glass from shore to shore. People walked upon it, careful not to speak. Beneath their feet, shadows moved slowly, like hands pressing from underneath. A child bent to touch the ice and whispered, "It's warm." When the thaw came, the current turned black. Fish floated belly up, pale as paper. The officials drained a portion of the river and found no poison, no explanation. Only a long chain, tangled and broken, heavy with riverweed. They sealed it away, but the smell of rust followed them home. After that, the empire forbade all talk of the Volga. Maps redrew it thinner, shorter, less real. Schools stopped mentioning it altogether, but you cannot edit a river. It continued to flow, even through silence, even through lies. Water does not need permission to remember. Poets began to speak of it again, quietly, in metaphors, under threat. They said the Volga carried voices instead of water, that it was writing the country's story in liquid scripture. The censors could erase lines from books, but not from the land itself. Every storm was another verse. By now, people no longer feared the ghosts, they feared forgetting them. Villagers built small altars by the river, not of stone but of soil, renewed each spring as the frost melted. They left bread, salt, and bits of iron, gifts for the ones beneath. The offerings always vanished by morning. In one city, a bridge collapsed with no warning, though engineers had sworn it sound. Survivors said they heard a sound before it fell, not metal cracking, but singing. A slow, deep hum like wind through bone. No bodies were ever recovered. The current had taken them all, one by one. The government announced a national holiday soon after, the Day of the River. Speeches were made, flags waved, orchestras played patriotic hymns. But beneath the applause, the real melody drifted through, a low, ancient rhythm, steady as a heartbeat under snow. That winter, the fog returned again, thicker than before. From its depths came the sound of hooves, faint, measured, certain. In the distance, a rider appeared, cloaked in frost, holding a torch that burned with no flame. He rode slowly across the ice, and behind him followed thousands of shadows. People fell to their knees, though they did not know why. Some wept, others laughed, no one spoke. When the fog cleared, the rider was gone, but the river glowed faintly for 3 nights after, a red so deep it looked like dawn. The empire blamed minerals, the people called it memory. And from that night forward, no one dared to say the empire remembered nothing, because the river had proven what the rulers had tried to deny, that forgetting is only a pause in history, not its end. The Volga had awakened, and with it, every name the snow had ever buried. The centuries moved on, slow as ice, fast as breath. Empires fell, flags changed, ideologies rose and rotted, yet the Volga kept its rhythm. Each thaw carried the same old story forward, bending it, softening it, but never letting it die. The river had become the archive no one could censor. Cities grew along its banks. Steel, glass, and neon reflected in the same current that once carried ash and bones. Tourists walked its bridges, unaware of what flowed beneath. They took photographs of sunsets on the water, never hearing the whisper just below the waves. The Volga had learned to speak quietly. In schools, children recited timelines scrubbed clean of rebellion. Their teachers smiled gently, as if history were a bedtime story with no blood. But sometimes a student would raise a hand and ask, "What happened before the reforms?" The classroom always went still. Even ignorance can recognize its own shadow. The government built monuments to peace, fountains carved from stone, the water dyed clear as glass. But each winter, when the pipes froze, the fountains cracked from within. The cracks spread like veins, and in the morning, the ice shimmered faintly red. Maintenance crews called it rust. The old janitors crossed themselves instead. Writers tried again to name the unnamed, to resurrect the forbidden. Some vanished, others were celebrated, most were simply forgotten. The river took their words anyway, carrying them to places even censorship could not reach. Every current was a vein of truth, beating beneath the empire's frozen skin. And when famine or flood returned, as it always did, the people turned once more to the water. They cupped their hands, whispered old prayers, asked for mercy. But the river offers none. It does not forgive, it does not condemn, it only remembers. One winter, a young filmmaker came to the Volga. He said he wanted to make a documentary about its beauty. The villagers told him to film during the day, never at night. He laughed, but obeyed. That evening, he played back his footage and saw something behind the mist. A rider, distant, unmoving, watching. The tape dissolved the next morning. In the capital, leaders spoke of modernization, of progress, of destiny. They did not mention the river, though its floods reached even their marble streets. Each time it rose higher, they built taller walls. But no wall can outgrow memory. Water, like truth, always finds a way in. At night, street sweepers heard strange music from the drains, low, rhythmic, almost like hooves. They told no one. In Russia, it is dangerous to report what you hear in the dark. Sometimes, silence is safer than explanation. Artists began painting rivers in crimson hues, saying it was only light reflecting through fog. But those who had seen the Volga knew the color too well. They recognized the way red glowed under ice, soft and patient, like an ember waiting for breath. Scholars argued that the story of Pugachev had been exaggerated, distorted, mythologized beyond truth. Yet the myth endured because it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to stay silent. He had become not a man, but a mirror. And mirrors, even cracked, still reflect. Sometimes the fog drifts far from the river, settling over cities that have forgotten its name. People wake uneasy, their dreams filled with hoofbeats and fire. They shake it off, call it nothing. But the feeling lingers, that the past is not gone, only patient. The peasants are gone, but their hunger remains. The nobles are gone, but their arrogance remains. The snow still falls, the blood still remembers its color. History moves in circles, not lines. Each generation calls its suffering new, never realizing they have inherited an echo. The Volga does not argue. It flows through ruin and renewal alike, gathering stories the way trees gather rings. In its depths sleep soldiers, peasants, poets, rulers, all stripped of their titles, equal at last. When storms come, their voices rise together, a chorus of remembrance beneath the thunder. On quiet nights, the river looks black, still, infinite. Yet those who listen long enough hear something beneath the water, not cries, not wails, but a steady heartbeat. It is not the sound of the dead. It is the sound of history breathing. In a small museum by the shore, a forgotten display holds a cracked iron mask, a rusted chain, and a fragment of wood labeled simply, "From the Rebellion." No one visits often, but each morning the glass is fogged from within, as if someone had been standing too close, whispering. And every spring, when the ice finally breaks, the river runs wild again, carrying its ghosts toward the sea. The sun catches on the water, turning it gold for a moment before it fades back to red. Children cheer at the sight, thinking it beautiful. The elders bow their heads. For the living, the river is only water. For the dead, it is memory. And for the land that birthed both, it is proof that no empire, no ruler, no lie lasts forever. Everything returns to the current. Everything finds its way home. The snow falls once more. The Volga hums beneath it, eternal, unrepentant. Somewhere in that endless whisper, a voice speaks, low, familiar, defiant. I am still here. And the river answers, quietly but sure, we remember.